Welcome, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to explore another important market structure in microeconomics monopoly. A monopoly market is very different from perfect competition. Here, instead of having many sellers competing with each other, we have a market that is dominated by one seller. So, what gives a monopoly this kind of market power? Let's find out. Before we begin, let's look at what you should be able to do by the end of this lesson. First, you should be able to explain the characteristics of a monopoly market structure. Second, you should be able to calculate profit or loss in the short run equilibrium. Third, you should be able to explain the shutdown point. This is particularly important when a monopolist is making a loss. And finally, you should be able to explain the long-run equilibrium of a monopoly. Keep these four learning outcomes in mind as we go through the lesson. Before looking at the theory, let's relate monopoly to some familiar examples. This slide shows several Malaysian organizations used in this lesson to illustrate monopoly type situations, such as Tenaga Nasional for electricity, KTM for rail transport, Petronas for oil and gas, Plus for expressways, Indah Water for water-related services, and Post Malaysia for postal services. The important idea is not simply the size of the company. The key idea is actually that a monopoly is associated with a sole or dominant provider of a product or service for which consumers have no close substitute. Now, let's identify the characteristics that give a monopoly its market power. To make the characteristics of monopoly easier to remember, we can use the acronym SNPB. S stands for single seller. There is only one firm producing the product in the market. N stands for no close substitute. Consumers do not have a close alternative to the product. P stands for price maker. Unlike a perfectly competitive firm, a monopolist has considerable power to influence the price. And B stands for barrier to entry. There are strong barriers preventing new firms from entering the market. So remember, S plus N plus P plus B equals monopoly power. Let's look at each characteristic more closely. The first characteristic is single seller. Imagine going to a market and finding that only one stall is selling the product you want. All the customers must buy from that one seller. A pure monopoly is therefore a one-firm industry. Because there is only one firm, that firm controls the supply side of the market. In other words, for a pure monopoly, the firm is the industry. That is very different from perfect competition, where one individual firm represents only a very small part of the total market. The second characteristic is no close substitutes. Looking at this picture, the consumers want this particular product, but there is no similar product available from another seller. This means that the product supplied by the monopolist is considered unique. Consumers have no close substitute and no reasonable alternative. So, if consumers really need the product, they cannot easily switch to another firm's product. This lack of alternatives contributes to the monopolist's market power. The third characteristic is that a monopoly is a price maker. This is the opposite of a firm under perfect competition, which is a price taker. A monopolist has considerable control over price. However, this does not mean that the monopolist can simply charge any price it wants. Why? Because consumers still respond to changes in the price. If the price becomes higher, the quantity demanded will normally decrease. So, the monopolist has market power, but it is still constrained by the market demand curve. The fourth characteristic is barrier to entry. Think about the wall shown in this picture. Existing firms are inside the market, but potential competitors cannot easily enter. These barriers help the monopolist maintain its position as the single seller. In other words, even if another entrepreneur sees that the monopolist is earning a high profit, entering the industry may be very difficult or even impossible. And this is one of the main reasons why monopoly power can continue over time. So, what actually prevents new firms from entering a monopoly market? This slide shows four important barriers. First, exclusive ownership. The firm may control an essential resource needed to produce the product. Second, government franchise or license. In some industries, only authorized firms are allowed to provide a particular service. Third, patents and copyright. Legal protection may give a producer exclusive rights over an invention, product, or creative work. And fourth, economies of scale. If producing on a very large scale leads to much lower average cost, it may be difficult for a new, smaller competitor to compete effectively. Together, these barriers protect the monopolists from potential competitors. Now let's look at the demand curve faced by a monopoly. Notice first that the demand curve slopes downward from left to right. Because the monopolist is the only seller, the firm's demand curve is also the market's demand curve. As shown on the slide, the demand curve is represented by P equals AR equals D. Price is equal to average revenue, and the demand curve represents the prices consumers are willing to pay at different quantities. The marginal revenue or MR curve lies below the demand curve. Why? Because if the monopolist wants to sell more units, it normally needs to reduce the price. So remember this important difference. Unlike perfect competition, the monopoly's demand curve is downward sloping and MR is below AR. Now that we understand the demand curve, let's examine the possible outcomes for a monopoly in the short run. There are three possibilities. First, supernormal profit. This occurs when total revenue is greater than total cost. Second, normal profit. Here, total revenue is equal to total cost, so economic profit is zero. And third, subnormal profit, or a loss. This occurs when total revenue is less than total cost. The important relationship is therefore between total revenue, TR, and total cost, TC. Let's examine each case using a graph. Before we start, remember the basic rule for profit maximization. A monopolist produces where MR equals MC. First, locate the point where the MR curve intersects the MC curve. From this equilibrium point, trace vertically downward to the quantity axis. Now, use the guidelines to connect the equilibrium output with the relevant values on the graph. At the profit maximizing output, move upward to the demand curve. The price that consumers are willing to pay is 12. So, our profit maximizing price is 12. And the corresponding profit maximizing output is 15 units. So we have price equals 12 and quantity equals 15. Now look at the average total cost curve. At an output of 15 units, the ATC is 10. Notice that price or average revenue is above average total cost. Therefore, AR is greater than ATC. This indicates supernormal profit. The difference between price and average total cost represents the profit earned on each unit. Here, the firm earns 12 but incurs an average cost of 10. So, the profit per unit is 2. Let's calculate the total revenue. Total revenue equals average revenue multiplied by quantity. So, TR equals 12 times 15 which equals 180. Next, calculate total cost. Total cost equals average total cost multiplied by quantity. So, TC equals 10 times 15, which equals 150. Finally, profit equals total revenue minus total cost. 180 minus 150 gives us 30. Therefore, the monopoly earns a supernormal profit of 30. Now let's consider the second possibility, normal profit. Again, we start with the same profit maximization rule, MR equals MC. Locate the intersection between MR and MC and trace downward to determine the equilibrium quantity. Next, we use the demand curve to determine the corresponding price. The profit maximizing price is 12, and the profit maximizing output is 15 units. Now observe the average total cost curve. In this case, the ATC curve is tangent to the demand curve at the relevant output. Therefore, average revenue is equal to average total cost, AR equals ATC. Total revenue is 12 multiplied by 15, giving us 180. Total cost is also 12 multiplied by 15, which equals 180. So, profit equals 180 minus 180. The answer is zero economic profit. This is called normal profit. Remember, normal profit does not mean the business earns nothing. It actually means that total revenue is just sufficient to cover all economic costs, including normal profit. The third possibility is subnormal profit, which means the firm is making a loss. Once again, begin where MR equals MC. Trace down the MR-MC intersection to determine the equilibrium quantity. Then, use the demand curve to identify the price. The monopoly charges a price of 12 and produces 15 units. Now look carefully at the ATC curve. This time, the ATC curve lies above the demand curve at the equilibrium output. So, AR is less than ATC. This indicates a loss. We now identify the average total cost at the equilibrium output. The ATC is 14 while the price is only 12. So, the firm loses 2 on each unit produced. Total revenue is 12 times 15, which equals 180. Total cost is 14 times 15, which equals 210. Therefore, profit equals 180 minus 210. The result is negative 30. So the firm incurs a loss of 30 or subnormal profit. But here's an important question. Should a firm making a loss immediately stop production? Not necessarily. To answer that, we need to understand the shutdown point.